Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Prove Identity Report, where we deliver actionable insights for identity and fraud executives. With me today is Tim Brown, Prove's head of product and a well-respected identity authentication expert. Tim was most recently chief technologist at IDEMIA, and he holds multiple patents in authentication, biometric liveness, and identity acquisition. Thank you so much for being here, Tim.
Thanks, Yuka. It's great to be here today.
So Tim, reusable identity is quickly becoming a buzzed about term in the identity space. And in fact, market analyst firm Liminal recently released a report outlining the market opportunity for reusable identity. Can you tell us what reusable identities are and why they're becoming so important?
To me, reusable identity is all about portability, interoperability, consistency, and consumer control. What exactly do I mean by that? I'd like to kind of pick at each one of those independently. If I think about identity establishment, I think it's important to talk about identity establishment because it's a key part to a reusable identity is how you can trust how the identity is being established. Establishing identity, be it for your bank app, your rideshare account, your grocery delivery website, whatever it is not always the most consumer-centric, friction-free experience that I'd like, or you'd like. Sometimes you're asked where you live when you were 6 years old and the color of shoes you like to wear at that time. Other times you have to capture your driver's license and selfie, and proving that you aren't, wearing a mask and that you're alive, and what they call so-called liveness detection. We're really fortunate at Prove to have a very low friction experience that reduces fraud while delighting our customers. But worse, if you have to repeat that process over and over again, it can be viewed as extreme friction. It makes you really unhappy. It leads to customer abandonment, and that actually is one of the most important topics I think around reusable identity that I like to focus on is portability. How as a customer, I just spent some time providing you with my identity documents, or collecting information about me, proving who I am. Why do I have to do that over and over again? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, but the market typically is thought of identity in a silo. And how does identity pertain to me, the app provider? It's whether I'm a marketplace app or like I said, a ride-sharing app, those types of things. They just care about making sure they're able to prove it for themselves. Reusable identity takes that notion and turns it on its head, and instead asks, how can a consumer take the identity to multiple apps and websites? It's portable because the consumer can reuse it. An important part of that, though, has to be that it's interoperable. It's closely related. It's one thing to claim my identity is portable and say I've got this thing I'd like to carry around with me, but the larger question is, how does it interact with a common language to ensure that I can reuse it? Does the identity rely on a standard or common set of rules? Much like we see in so-called social logins and identity and access management markets that rely on technologies like OpenID Connect to ensure interoperability, reusable credentials need to rely on a similar means to ensure integration. Ease for the company that's asking you to provide your identity, as well as a common set of guidelines to ensure a consistent and pleasurable experience for the consumer. I mean, that's really important too, because at the end of the day, it costs money to set these things up and integrate, the technology. So having a way that's interoperable that everybody understands is very important. And the next thing is consistency. How does this impact both consumer and customer requesting the identity? Obviously, consistency is very important to a customer. You get comfortable with the things that you do quite often. So you understand, it's important for the consumer to understand the credential that they've created, that identity, and they've done it once. They're comfortable with it. They've gotten used to using it. How often now, everybody, looks like, we have ways of making payments and doing things that we've all become accustomed to because they've made it in such a way that's very frictionless. So identity would have to have something very similar. That's a common interaction. You get used to it, regardless of which app or website you're interacting with. It's the same experience for you. Typically, it's branded so the consumer knows they can trust it. They aren't being scammed or phished. Considering all the things that are happening now, the hacks that are going on, the social engineering, those types of things, I think it's important that there's that level of trust associated with the consumer and this identity. And then for the company that's consuming the identity, relying on that common language I talked about, an identity assurance of identity and more specifically identity assurance, that translates into a measurable trust. So if I have if I know that that Tim is presenting his identity and it's an assurance level of 2, then I know that that's a very trustworthy, or an assurance level of 3. It's a very trustworthy identity, and it's measurable, and I can rely on that to be consistent across my entire user base. And importantly, I think, is that the company doesn't have to be experts in identity to integrate it. I mean, in all the years that I've been in the identity space, one of the most common refrains that I've seen as it relates to technology and products that are out there is that it's too darn hard to integrate. I mean, you need to understand identity to be able to do it, and it's led to this sort of cottage industry of requiring experts to go in and really platoon for a deployment and understand how to integrate and really and address the fraud rates and that are specific to that vertical. So, and if you want them to really, with that in mind, you really want them to say, all I need to do is how trustworthy is identity, and be able to measure that, and then I can, that response is a measurable attribute, and that gives me all I need to know. It's a simple, common, integration point, and that makes it very consistent for the company that's consuming the identity. And then finally, I think I'd be remiss not to mention consumer control. For me, a key part of reusable identity is the notion that you, as the consumer, have agency over the types of data that is shared with relying parties asking for your identity. How often, as GDPR pushed out changes to cookie policy, I know I've been a lot more cognizant of the types of things that I'm sharing. And so I look at all the cookie policies that I get asked about when I go to websites. It should be no different with identity. When I show up and I'm, interacting with an alcohol delivery service, what they should care about is that, well, one, that they're confident that the person holding the phone is the person who's attached to the identity on it, but also that I'm over 21. They shouldn't care about, necessarily about my date of birth, or, be able to see my driver's license number, or, additional data about me. That doesn't belong to them. They shouldn't need to know that. So I want to give consumers that control over the types of data that they're pushing out there into the world. And it should be quite clear to them too, that transparency is equally important. So reusable identities are becoming increasingly important, clearly. The Liminal Report talks about it extensively. I think we see them taking on many forms, suiting many different markets. On the top of my head, I came from a very civil identity oriented business prior to coming here. So I think immediately to things like mobile driver's licenses, and then soon to be released mobile passports, to the reusable credentials that that are being used to drive government services and access those. There has been a substantial uptick in commercial opportunities as well. Things like programs like Swedish Bank ID, Aadhaar in India, Estonia EID, or sort of mixed government and public-private combinations of programs that are out there, and they're making splashes and opening up some very interesting use cases as they're doing it. There's a large land grab happening in decentralized identity and verified credentials. Obviously, it's really as crypto markets shape up, and there's this new push for NFTs and really understand the whole virtual reality worlds that we're walking ourselves to, being able to establish identity in those and be able to trust it. Those areas are really opening up this notion of decentralized ID. And then they're looking at really novel ways of approaching identity and self-sovereign identity and things like that, that enterprise passwords could never tackle. So it's kind of interesting to see how these things are, how we're approaching the bit. Let's back up and let me tackle reusable identities again, that part of it. So I felt like that was a little clumsy.
Yeah, do you want me to re-ask the question, or?
No, I'll start from the actually in this last paragraph, where I said, I guess I talked about the alcohol delivery. I think that was fine. I want to start with the reusable identities are becoming increasingly important.
Okay.
Let's start there. So reusable identities are becoming increasingly important. We see them taking on many forms, suiting many different markets. Off the top of my head, I can point to civilian ID programs like mobile driver's licenses and the soon to be released true mobile passports. That's a market that I'm quite familiar with, having come from a very civilian identity focused company, to things like reusable credentials that are driving access to government services, that are opening up new types of use cases like e-notary services and things like that. There's been a large commercial usage uptake of reusable identities and identity credentials, things like Swedish Bank ID I can think of, Aadhaar in India, which was really a government program, but it's being used for commercial services like banking. Estonia EID, which is also another mixed use government program. They're making a splash. There's also a huge land grab happening in decentralized identity and verified credentials. Companies are enabling so-called self-sovereign identities in novel ways, and it's spilling over into the enterprise marketplace for doing things like password reset and remote employee onboarding. Next question.
Thanks, Tim. And you actually just touched upon this a little bit, but I want to double click on it to make sure the distinction's clear. How are reusable identities different from the current digital identity that most of us are used to using online? Things like passwords or security questions like, what's your mother's maiden name?
Right. That seems like a bit of a layup answer, if you ask me, or a layup question for an answer, I guess. You know, and the answer is equally as simple, I think. Reusability is key here. Current digital identity schemes vary, which leads to oversaturation in the consumer market, consumer confusion, potential for social engineering and other vulnerabilities. You know, things like, do you trust service X, Y, and Z with all your identity data? Who is X, Y, and Z, and why do they need this information about me? Some of the basic questions, you know, that were being asked on the internet for so long. It's like now it's no longer about the remembering all these passwords, but it's like thinking about, well, do I need to really share this type of information with you? Do you know this company that's gathering your identity data is keeping it safe? I mean, there have been plenty of high-profile hacks. Most recently, an identity access management provider was hacked, and gosh knows what that's going to lead to. And there have been plenty of commercial entities that have been hacked, and credit reporting agencies and things like that. That all of our data is ending up online as it is. If you have a trusted and reusable identity, you can leverage over and over again that you're in control of. That's going to drive up user satisfaction, while drastically reducing your exposure to fraud. It becomes I know when I'm logging in using my reusable identity that I'm sharing it in a way that's with somebody that's trustworthy. I'd also point out there's a lot of what is called digital identity today, and you mentioned it in your question here, roundabout way, things that are knowledge-based questions to establish your identity. And it's well documented that those KBA types of prompts are vulnerable. I know I was part of a credit the CRA hack. All my data is available on the dark web. So the question's becoming increasingly difficult for me to answer because I don't remember a lot of this stuff, these phone numbers or specific addresses and things like that I had certain times in my life. And that's the only way they can find these unique crumbs of data that I may know that the hackers don't already have access to. I think as reusable identities surface, they'll be grounded in high identity assurance that's tied to cryptographic truth of possession. So really tied to your device, tied to you, and it will reduce dependency on those types of KBAs and other vulnerable types of authenticators. Reusable identities that are strongly bound to highly assured identity will be the death knell for passwords.
Thanks, Tim. And let's talk about the Liminal Report again. So in the preface to Liminal's report on reusable identities, they state, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, to facilitate reusable identities, the current paradigm needs to shift to one that supports interoperable networks, public-private partnerships, and fully fledged ecosystems that provide consumers with data mobility. Can you explain what you think they mean by a paradigm shift, and how far away do you think we are from enabling reusable identities, considering that some leading firms, such as Prove, already have this technology?
Sure. Paradigm shift's a great collection of words there to talk about this. I think as I think about attempts at digital identity, I think of the cold start problem. We talk a lot about it internally. And what do I mean by that? So there are plenty of examples of digital identity efforts that have failed or stalled because they are waiting for user adoption, and conversely, user adoption is waiting for business use case adoption. That's that type of cold start problem has plagued the industry quite extensively. And maybe a lot of people would be surprised to hear that in the United States, there are a handful of states that are actually issuing mobile driver's license as an identity credential. The adoption has been slow. I mean, we've heard about it now, because Apple has made a big splash about having those driver's license show up on their phones, but they've been available for a number of years. These portable identities are designed to be much more than a digital representation of your physical driver's license. So you would think naturally that this would be very exciting, and people would be rushing out to get them installed on their phone. They can open up a whole host of use cases like accessing government services, online authentication, age verification, a lot of the things that I've talked about already. However, with some notable exceptions, and until the most recent announcement from Apple, the adoption of mobile driver's licenses has been slow. It's been a cold start problem through and through. MDLs have suffered. Users are curious about them, for sure, and they see local news stories about them, and they run out and they're like, oh, I can download this. But then they quickly realize that they can't do anything but show it off to their friends. It's like, hey, I've got this cool app on my phone. Look, it's got my face on it and it looks like my driver's license. But then you find out, well, law enforcement can't read it, or your local liquor store doesn't know what to do with it. It's like, oh, that's cool. Looks like something my kid could, rip off and put on his phone. You can't travel with it. So now what? What do you do with it? And then on the other side of that, adoption, adoption drops off. And then the other side of that, businesses and entities look at the fact that only a small subset of the population has a mobile driver's license, and they don't want to commit to accepting or integrating it. Classic chicken and the egg problem. Now where mobile driver's license programs have been successful, and I can think of Louisiana as having a fairly successful program there, there's been a strong private and public partnership with strong support legislatively to enable it. And then if you look at some of the things I previously mentioned, like some of the international programs that have been successful, like Adahar, Bank ID in Estonia's EID, they've been successful because they found ways to drive adoption through private and public partnerships, and finding use cases that get consumers excited. I really think with mobile driver's license as an example, once we start seeing adoption at travel, that'll be the use case that really starts to push people moving towards it. So when Liminal, consumers get excited about that, and because it's making their lives easier, they're interacting with it, and they're doing, it's a product that they can find useful, and on the other side of it, businesses find useful to accept. So when Liminal talks about a paradigm shift, it really is getting away from sort of siloed and proprietary approaches to identity to a common language for sharing identity. There are efforts that approach this through formal international standards, like what's mobile driver's license, and what the ISO/IEC standard, and what ICAO is doing with mobile passports, and then others that have grown through private-public partnerships that are driving similar standardization, like leveraging decentralized ID and verified credentials. All of these have to be coupled with strong value props that are interested in exciting to consumers, and consumers need to see value in adopting a reusable identity, trust that it's formed through an open and common language to really buy into wanting to use it.
Makes sense. And how is Prove leading this shift to reusable identity? What do we have that other identity verification authentication providers do not?
Sure, that's an awesome question. Prove is leading the shift to reusable identity through our foundational Prove Identity Network, which we refer to as PIN. PIN is our platform that issues and maintains what we believe the most accurate digital tokens for consumer identities. And it's really designed to thwart 6 major categories of identity fraud, including synthetic identities and true name fraud. With PIN, we've created a network of reusable and durable identities that's unlike anything else in the industry. Given the fact that we have such extraordinary transactional access across all channels and keys, we're uniquely positioned to operate as a real-time, high-trust identity agency. We leverage our advanced machine learning techniques to drive the highest possible successes with the lowest possible fraud. And honestly, our goal is to have more than 3 billion reusable identities by the end of 2024. That's a huge number. But we're really excited, and we're making great progress to getting to that point. This positioning allows us to enrich identity attributes and improve upon KYC and traditional IDV data, device and data signals and authentication events in a way that provides a graded trust that really culminates in a real-time identity assurance. And we do so in an open and transparent manner. And we're speaking with a public common language for identity. As the global shift to transact digitally accelerates, there is an arms race in fraud that is pushing rates to rise to unprecedented levels. In 2020, $28.6 billion was lost to card fraud alone. Over the next 10 years, it's estimated that the card and mobile payment industry will suffer fraud losses of $408 billion. Rates of fraud will continue to escalate despite the acute awareness of the issue across industries, substantial investments in loss prevention, and robust ecosystems that are kind of growing up around fraud prevention vendors. While suboptimal, industry players have had little choice but to accept fraud loss as a cost of doing business, and nobody wants to do that. We've had an industry of risk-based authentication solutions that are being deployed right now that have helped, but their efficacy is insufficient and will continue to degrade. And we see basically three reasons for that. As more transactions become digital, there will be a greater volume of transactions and a larger pool of money in aggregate that is at risk. The shift towards digital transactions as a primary way of conducting business gives bad actors both more opportunity and greater incentives. After Congress raced to make hundreds of billions of dollars worth of pandemic assistance available, you saw how quickly fraudsters followed suit and ramped up their efforts and siphoned off close to $87 billion. That was pretty substantial over the last 24 months. And they did it quickly. It was mind-boggling how fast it happened. They find the weak points and they go after it. Two, persistent data breaches, in finding, I talked about this earlier, finding leaked PII records online in the dark web is even easier now. And it makes it much easier for bad actors to assert victims' correct information. From 2010 to 2020, there were more than 10,000 data breaches that reported more than 1.4 billion records leaked in the United States alone. Think about that. That means most likely everybody's data has been leaked out onto the dark web. Three companies are competing heavily on user experience during customer onboarding and authentication. And those that are not capable of minimizing friction while preventing fraud will lose out. So, seems pretty straightforward. Unhappy consumer leads to abandonment. And according to a survey of 184 U.S. financial institutions, new deposit account opening abandonment is over 50% for lending products, and for lending products is even higher. And it's not just RBA. Other types of point solutions that rely on techniques like visual document authentication, have been shown to be quite vulnerable to inexpensive fake documents that are being created. The identity documents are designed really to be read in three spectrums of light. So when you're capturing one from a mobile driver's license, you're relying on a single spectrum of light that makes it removes 2/3 of the security features that are built into them. So that reduces the attack vector for a fraudster and makes it much easier to pass these fake documents through. And they're coming out of places like China and places like that are actually generating them at will with your photo, with real PII on them that can be checked back at the DMVs that could potentially that can pass these fake checks. Proof solution to overcoming these limitations in RBA and these other point solutions is really twofold. We incorporate cryptographic keys and cryptography as a key component to our authentication. We leverage cryptography as a source of truth that allows financial institutions, companies, and governments to trust that the data that's being asserted is actually Tim's data and is actually true. Phone numbers provide a ubiquitous way of using cryptographic truths via SIM card authentication and biometric sensors on the device. Secondly, I'm going to start back over on this because I felt that was a little clumsy. Proved solution to overcoming these inherent limitations of RBA and other point solutions is really twofold. First, Prove incorporates cryptography as a key component to authentication. Leveraging cryptography as a source of truth allows financial institutions, companies, and governments to trust the data asserted by users is actually true. It's Tim's data. I know Tim's holding the phone. Phone numbers provide a ubiquitous way of using cryptography via SIM card authentication and biometric sensors on the device. So I know it's Tim. I know the way he's interacting with the device. There's no SIM swaps. That type of data really pulls together and ties tightly to the cryptography that's inherent in a SIM. Secondly, Prove uses machine learning and authenticated data to prove that cryptographic key really belongs to the consumer and that the key is currently being held by the consumer. And we refer to this really as possession and reputation of the device. And we do this by providing dynamic assurance levels and trust scores that are tied to the device and also tied to whether Tim's actually holding the device. And finally, Prove's solution is vastly superior to point solutions like DocAuth because we reduce fraud while accelerating pass rates with very little friction. And if there's one thing that capturing a document is known for from a mobile phone is the high friction that's attached to it. It proves to be challenging. Lighting can be challenging, things like that.
Thanks so much, Tim, for these insights, and thank you everybody for watching. For more fraud and digital identity insights, head to prove.com.